Welcome to Lynn Cullen Live. Talk radio without the static. Email your questions and comments to lynncullenshow@gmail.com. And now your host, Lynn Cullen.
Hey, and a good morning to you. It's September, April. Okay, is this the last day? May has 31. It's just 30 days, September, April. 8. Anyway, good God. And it's summer. Feels that way. How you doing, guys? Hope you had a good weekend. Longer weekend. Today, hey, Susan is normally on the show today. I'm sorry. She's not today. She's going to be tomorrow. Okay? I have to remember. I'm all mixed up. I think today is Monday, and of course she should be on tomorrow. That's Wednesday. But so that's, anyway, today's Tuesday. She's on tomorrow, Wednesday, for just this week. Okay? Boy, oh boy, lots to talk about. The Tree of Life, the horror that transpired there 4.5 years ago. Finally, the perpetrator will be tried beginning today. The jury seated and opening arguments, I believe. Can't imagine what argument his defense makes. And it's so, isn't it laughable, kind of, sort of, when, I understand reporters having to say the alleged murderer. When there are cases where, no one's arguing that he didn't do it. A lot of media going to be here from all over the place. There was a piece, where did I see? The BBC had a big piece yesterday. And it's odd, to read somebody else's, some person who's not native, to see their take on a story that, just viscerally was felt here. In some ways, as I read the BBC's article, I thought, come on. Their article actually starts out at my synagogue, Temple Sinai, also in Squirrel Hill. And the reporter obviously attended a service there and interviewed the new rabbi, who said this: our security budget is ridiculously high. It's a sad reality that we need to do this. He went on to say, I have asked my priest friends, what would it feel like for you guys to have armed security at Christmas Eve services or Easter services? And they look at me like I have 3 noses. It is unsettling, the level to which Jewish buildings, like anything Jewish, day schools, synagogues, now are secured. Even if they had wanted to be perceived as a welcome entity, it's hard to put that image out there when the first thing a visitor encounters is an armed police officer, locked doors. But there was one line in this story that I thought, here it is. They talk about the fact that this happened, the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history. And it says then, meanwhile, the Squirrel Hill Jewish community has had to live on edge since the attack, as anti-Semitic incidents continue to rise. I live in the Squirrel Hill Jewish community. I haven't been living on edge. I mean, I think that statement alone suggests that, Pittsburgh Jews are, walking around looking over their shoulders. And I just don't think that's true. People go on with their lives. We're reminded of the horror every time, you go into a synagogue and encounter the kind of security. I was with friends last night who had just been in, I believe, Phoenix, and one of them had gone to the Jewish community center there, and he was blown away by the security. He said he first encountered security just driving into the parking lot. He said there was an armed guard at the entrance to the parking facility. There was another armed guard at the entrance to the building once you had gotten through the security into the parking garage. I don't know. And then the New York Times yesterday had a rather large story about how what happened here created a level of vigilance in the Jewish community that has not existed in this country before, and how anti-Semitic attacks and or threats are being watched, tallied at a single location in Chicago. I mean, it's just mind-blowing. And actually, the person who's very involved in that used to be the head of security here for the Jewish community. The fact that you need a head of security. Head of security. Oh, well. So anyway, that starts today, and my heart goes out to those who are truly involved, for those who will be witnesses, for those who will have to relive the terror of that day. My heart goes out to them. I don't know. So, there's that. I came across a little snippet. I'm looking for it. Here it is. This was in an article. It's just a quote from a novelist who I don't know. Not sure how to pronounce the name. But it resonated with me, what she says, because it is so true. And it is this. Every life is a novel for those who are curious enough to look into it. Every life is a novel. And I firmly believe that. It's one of the reasons I'm so drawn to obituaries, because they're little novels of one life. But I can't imagine that there's anyone, including any of you, whose lives are not fascinating in many ways if they're looked at with curiosity and interest. And I was reminded of this. It's why this resonated so much with me, because I spent some time over this long weekend reading somebody else's diary. This was somebody who I knew as a child. As a matter of fact, I suspect his hands were the first hands that touched my body. He was the doctor at my birth. So he brought me into this world. He was the doctor who, when I was a sick child, would come with his black bag to the house and be at my bedside and provide me comfort. So this is a man who I knew in my life. He had kept a diary. How the heck it ended up, and I still don't quite understand how, it ended up in the possession of my family. And then ended up in the possession of my brother's eldest son, who is an archivist and someone who is just fascinated by any historical document or documentation. He's the one who first told me that, you know, if you go through books, and the first thing he did it at our parents' home. He says, you go through books and just sort of like flip through them and page. And he says, often something falls out. And often what falls out is fascinating. A letter stuck in there, or a note scribbled. And he did it in my parents' house, and lo and behold, you know, every book had something in it, but yeah, stuff starts falling out and provides clues to who last held it, and clues about them and their lives. Now, some people, I suspect, are not intrigued by this kind of thing, looking into some other person's existence. And it is true, some people live more, I suspect, adventuresome lives, or maybe even consequential lives than others. But it also is true that every life, a novel for those who are curious enough to look into it. My nephew transcribed the entire diary, and I read it this weekend, and I was blown away. And this man, his name is Lewis Milson, M-I-L-S-O-N, Lewis Milson. I don't know what his name was at birth, but it wasn't, I suspect, Lewis Milson. He was born in Russia, and he came to the United States by himself as a teenager, leaving his family there. And he came, I can't quite tell, I think about 1916, or maybe a little earlier, 1914 or so. because the diary starts a few years after that, after he's come to the United States. He starts keeping a diary. Now, just the fact, again, that generation, the immigrant generation, which of course continues to occur. There is an immigrant generation in this country now, and I'm sure their individual stories are extraordinary as well. The immigrant experience in and of itself is a story of courage and often hardship and extraordinary doggedness, perseverance, work. And that's what comes out of this diary. I mean, if you think about it, here's a guy who spoke, I don't know what he spoke. He spoke probably Yiddish. He spoke Russian. I can tell from the diary he knew German rather well as well. English? The diary is written in English. And yet that was a language that he would have been learning. And his English is remarkably good. He had nothing. He really had nothing. There was a few aunts that were in New York who initially helped him, and then he went to work. And of course, the work was as menial as it comes. That's what first-generation immigrants do. His dream was to become an educated man and to be a doctor. But even that was not an easy thing for a young immigrant who had no money, and also for a young Jewish immigrant who had no money. But this guy, I mean, during his lifetime and as I knew him, I respected him because he was the doctor. But I had no sense of him as a heroic figure. He was a small, wiry little guy, not very good looking, thick glasses. Amazingly, I don't recall him speaking with an accent. But he ends up in St. Louis. He's like 20 years old, and he's going to a medical school. He's taking, physiology and botany. And I mean, my God, you suffer through this diary of his, he's not doing well in this class. He's struggling in that class. He's despairing that he'll ever be able to do it. And I'm thinking, and he's doing it in a language that he's not that, adept at. And he's alone. He's so alone. He never stops working. So to pay to get into the schools, he has to work, of course, the entire time he's there, and then has to take breaks where he gets money again, so that he can support himself and continue his studies. And he ends up having to at one point he flunks a class and despairs, contemplates suicide. He's also despairing because he has not heard anything about his family in 6 years. His mother especially is on his mind. And then he gets a letter. A letter comes to him through the Red Cross. And it tells him of the turmoil and trouble that his family back in Russia is suffering. And he learns his mother has died. His brother has been crippled. The war, the Bolsheviks are, there. The Cossacks have always been there. For Jews in Russia, never a good idea to be there. But they stayed, and he, of course. But to imagine him so young and alone and often despairing. So he flunks a class and he thinks that's it. And then God knows how. This is before you could Google it or go online. How the hell he starts looking at other schools that might let him make up that course and he finds, as he puts it, Michigan University. He meant the University of Michigan, had a class in the summer. And he thought, if I can get there, if I can take that class, I can keep this dream alive. And he tried to work even harder to make enough money so he could get to Michigan, and he falls short. And so there's an entry, and I tried to capture some of this stuff. There's an entry, and he says, I put my sack on my back and I began to walk. He walked from St. Louis to Ann Arbor. He, of course, whenever he could, got a ride. So he's hitchhiking as well. Every once in a while, someone gives him a ride, and he is so grateful if, 20 miles that he doesn't have to walk. He's sleeping in the open. And then he starts jumping freights. Here's one. I nearly landed in jail. A dick. So that's what a dick intercepted me and made me go back to town with him. He threatened to put me in jail for 6 months. The matter ended with me not in jail and being able to buy a ticket for Toledo. The ticket was $3.97, and it left me with but 18 cents in my pocket, 200 miles from my destination, and hungry at that. And then the next line is, fortunately, I got a job in a nearby restaurant, which gave me 40 cents and a meal. The next morning, I reached Toledo. I made my way from Toledo, finally hit Ann Arbor, and I was tired, slept like a dead one. Okay, so here, then he ends up riding freight. Some of the diary entries, he's riding on the top of a freight car and enjoying the trip. He's saying, boy, this is what a beautiful country. He talks about the hills and the little farms and the houses and the expanse. I just found it the most mind-blowing sort of perspective-changing glimpse of a life. He ends up, obviously, the dream comes true. I knew him. And he was a doctor, and he had a practice. And by the end of his practice, there were 7 other doctors in his practice. I, as a child, remember having dinner at his home. Very nice home. He did it. Mind-blowing. And he didn't have, and he says often, you can see, I mean, he's a kid. He's this like gawky, uncertain, no adults to like give him, no father there to sort of help him along, no mother to, dry his tears, whatever. He's just on his own. And yes, there are encounters with Jew haters, but he's, he goes to churches. He attends church. He talks about Christmas very matter of factly. And I got to tell you, the guy was very Jewish. But he was living in this very Christianized country. And he worried about being with a Christian girl. He started to like one, and he told himself he had to pull away because it was not fair to her, that he was quite sure her family would not tolerate her being with him. Just trying to come of age, become a man, all alone. My family figures in the diary a little bit because he fell in love with my father's older sister. And quite a bit of the diary in the early 20s is about him. He's at the time, he's got a residency at a hospital in Green Bay. That's how he ended up there. And he's struggling and intending to become, yes, a doctor. He's going to do it. But he finds that her family, that'd be my grandparents, he suspected they weren't so into her marrying him because he was a poor immigrant. Even if he was going to be a doctor, and actually already was kind of but he had the sense, and he says it in the diary, that they think I'm not enough American. And that makes him crazy because he was an American. He quickly became a citizen. He enlisted in World War I. In the midst of trying to go to medical school, he also did that. I don't know. And in fact, yeah, it didn't work out with my aunt. And both of them went down to Chicago, which is what Jews would do from a small town in Wisconsin, to find mates. And she found a born in America Jew that she married. And he found a born in America Jew that he married. Anyway, why do we think we have any right to complain is what I want to know. The bitching and moaning that I hear all around me from people who are so privileged, never had just 18 cents in their pocket, running from, the railroad police, never going to see their family again in a strange country that you throw your lot in with. And one of the reasons I have such contempt for people who are anti-immigrant is having known so many in my life. And almost two, I right now can't think of any that don't fit into this. Hardworking. People who were willing to suffer unimaginably for the chance at the possibilities and freedoms that they could not find in their country of birth, but they did see as conceivable in our nation. When I look at the so-called marauding, the people who set off the killer at Tree of Life, he was set off because he'd been told by the right-wingers and the Republicans that the country was being invaded by immigrants. And all I can think of, every one of those immigrants, is to me Lewis Milson, with all of the gifts and pluckiness and guts and courage that would be required to do what they're doing. How do you put down people and ascribe to them all these negative motivations and character traits when in fact they clearly are the opposite of that? They ain't coming here for a free ride or a handout. They're coming here for a and they work their tails off. Often, like this guy, looking over their shoulders for the cops. I don't know. I was moved to tears by it. And his story, I suspect, is not unusual at all. It's the classic immigrant story. And that story is a story of extraordinary courage and perseverance. And those are qualities I don't necessarily see evidenced a lot by the complainers and whiners around us. Just coming off Memorial Day, people died. He put himself in a position to die for a country he barely had been in. People die. All right, I'm sorry. I just needed you to hear I've just been so blown away by the difference that a few generations make. And in some respects, I knew his two sons, both doctors, and they didn't have any of they didn't struggle. I think those who struggle live greater lives, right? Their lives are better novels, without a doubt, than the comfortable. I was thinking of some of I know people who spend their whole lives golfing. That doesn't make a good novel. Golfing and complaining. Okay. Perspective. I wish we could get a little perspective. Here's perspective for you. I found this. A guy named Jordan Rivera in Florida was at a bar, and he had to relieve himself, so he left the bar. I guess they didn't have a bathroom. He left the bar, I guess, to do his business outside. And says here that he fell into a pond and had his arm bitten off by an alligator. If he'd only used the bathroom. He fell in, probably drunk, and of course an alligator's there, takes his arm. And it's this quote of his from an article that just blew me away. He said, I guess to a reporter who was doing the story, I lost an arm. It's not the end of the world. I so appreciate that level of, let's put things in perspective. Something that we just don't do enough. I lost an arm. It's not the end of the world. And I can think of almost all the trials and tribulations that I might be suffering. And I can put that in place of I lost an arm. And then follow it with, but it's not the end of the world. And it's that level of perspective that we need to keep in our heads and our hearts, I think. All right. So tell me that you're aware of the story about the nun, the dead nun in Missouri or something. Tell me you know this story. I believe CNN has covered it. I got it. I'm looking at a picture of her. Her name is Sister Wilhelmina Lancaster. She died in 2019. She was 95 years old. She was buried in her full, old-fashioned nun, what do they call that, habit. I don't know, is that what they call it? Yeah. And this is a story that the Catholic News Agency initially reported, and it's gone viral. For some reason, her body was dug up 4 years after it had been buried. And that was to move it to a different final resting place inside a chapel in the monastery I guess she had lived in. Why she wasn't put there initially, I don't know. There's so much I don't know. But here's the thing. When they dug up the coffin. I guess they bothered to look inside. And she, in 4 years, had not in any way decomposed. She looked every bit as whole as she had the day she was buried, and she had not been embalmed. Yeah. Now, I have since, have you seen pictures of her? Because they've got her laid out in the monastery, and people are coming from far and wide to stare at this dead woman who is, according to Catholicism, the word is incorrupt. Her body has not corrupted. So the church has begun an investigation. Meanwhile, some people are taking this incorruptibility of her body as an obvious sign that she is a saint and that she is so much closer to, I guess, Jesus than the rest of us. They're waiting in line at the Queen of Apostles Monastery in Gower, Missouri, to look at Sister Wilhelmina dead. Apparently, according to the Catholic News Agency, there have been more than 100 known incorruptible bodies, and they have all been canonized. It is believed that if you are an incorruptible body, that you don't, you're supposed to dust to dust, ashes to ashes. The idea is that an incorruptible body denotes a saint and a witness to the truth of the resurrection and of life to come. So that's why, yeah. So here's the thing. I don't want to, I don't want to mock, religious faith, but I also find it ghoulish that they've got her splayed out there and everybody's coming and staring at her. As I've said, my religion says it is extraordinarily impolite to stare at a dead person. The reason being is they cannot return your gaze, which I find a wonderful thought. Anyway, so I come from a different tradition, but here's the thing. If you talk to not faithful people, but again, I hate to say it, scientists, they will tell you that we really don't know how common it might be for bodies to defy, the normal decomposition process, because we're not in the habit of digging up the dead. There are, however, many famous cases of well-preserved human remains. And I'm not talking about like mummies, because they were intentionally preserved, or the bog people that they found preserved in, the certain kind of environment that preserved them and kept them away from scavengers and the kind of bacteria that might, like to feast on them. So anyway, if you ask the experts on decomposition, generally it takes a body about 5 years to become skeletonized. 5 years. And that is if it's not in a coffin, if it is just like in a shroud and put in the ground, which is, I think I told you how I'm going to go. And even then, if you just plant the body, it takes 5 years. And so this one scientist, when asked about the nun, Sister Wilhelmina, looking so, she looks good. He says, I personally don't find it too surprising that the remains are relatively well preserved after only 4 years. So they laid her out. It said here that yesterday they were going to encase her in glass so she can be stared at for the rest of her death. I was going to say rest of her life. I don't know. Near the altar of St. Joseph in the chapel, in order to welcome the faithful. You will be welcomed by the dead Sister Wilhelmina. Anyway, this is something I came across, and I find it bizarre on so many levels. By the way, if she was 95 when she died, man, she looks good. She looks like she should just get up. She looks healthy. I'm not kidding. I will note, not that it matters, that she is African American. So I don't know if you guys have encountered that particular story, but man, that blew me away. I guess what blows me away is not that she is preserved, but that, I guess whatever gives people comfort. And I guess this sense that death isn't final gives a lot of people comfort. But personally, I don't see it. Okay, can I read you something that I read, which I thought was incredibly well written, in that, the whole Russia hoax, the first impeachment of Donald Trump, what that whole thing was about. It's like the first time I saw it sort of condensed in a little tiny little story that you would tell somebody. Just take a minute or two, explain it, and tell it in a somewhat dramatic fashion. So imagine you never had heard this at all. And then I told you this. On August 2nd, 2016, so that would be what? That would be, God help us, that would be just a few months before this nation elected one of the worst humans on earth to be the president of the United States. One of the least qualified, the most corrupt. Talk about corrupted. Man, he's alive, and his body and in his soul is in a greater state of corruption than any body in the cemetery. Okay, on August 2nd, 2016, Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort conducted a secret meeting with Russian intelligence agent Konstantin Kilimnik at a ritzy cigar bar in New York City. The two men had done business in Ukraine, where Manafort, a globe-trotting, slick political operative, had made $60 million advising Kremlin-allied oligarchs. Kilimnik had flown to New York to give Manafort a so-called peace plan for Ukraine that called for cutting off the eastern part of the country as a Russian-controlled autonomous state. Kilimnik said that Trump's support for that plan would be helpful. In return, Manafort handed Kilimnik internal campaign polling indicating that Trump could pull an upset by winning swing states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Well, Russia soon thereafter targeted selected social media users in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Targeted them with messages portraying Hillary Clinton as deeply corrupt, as racist, and as seriously ill. So after Trump won the election by 77,000 votes spread over Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, a delighted Kilimnik attended the inauguration. That secret meeting and that secret back and forth and cooperation, and the writer says, dare I say, collusion, was just one of dozens of exchanges between the Trump campaign and Russians. Trump and his cronies were not mere bystanders in Russia's attack on our democracy. And that was the conclusion of the Republican-chaired Senate Intelligence Committee. The Republican-chaired Senate Intelligence Committee said that Trump and his pals were active participants in that attack on democracy. But this is what they now, and have ever since, called a hoax. And that gaslighting continues. And just stop and remember that as president, Trump promoted Putin's interests at every turn. He was just unbearably submissive, do you remember? Submissive and flattering to him. It was the most god-awful thing to watch. And any American, knowing our history with Russia and Putin was sickened by what they saw. And it was only when Trump lost in 2020 that Putin gave up on maybe being able to pull off what Kalimnik had tried to tell Manafort. We're just going to annex Ukraine. And if we have your nod, that'd be good. So that was the peace plan of taking Eastern Ukraine. And it was only after Trump lost that Russia began to plan the invasion. And after Russia invaded, do you remember that Trump called Putin a genius? If Trump had won in 2020, Trump would not have stopped anyway Russia's intent, nor would he and we have aided the Ukrainians. And that this guy stands now as the putative frontrunner of the Republican Party to be their standard bearer. In less than a year and a half, another election, 2024. Whoa. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. What else I got here? Nothing. Oh, do you hear the one about, well, actually, that was a headline. Have you heard the one about the lawyer using artificial intelligence? Have you heard? Some lawyer let a chat bot, I guess, write his brief for a case that was suing an airline for a passenger said he was injured by the drink tray hitting his knee, and so sued the airline. And the lawyer has a chat bot write the brief that he puts forward there in, I think it was federal court. And I mean, the brief said there were a dozen relevant court decisions that showed that this man was owed quite a bit of recompense from the airline. Why there was the case of Martinez versus Delta Airlines and Zickerman versus Korean Airlines, and of course Varghese versus China Southern Airlines. Here's the problem. When the airlines attorneys, having gotten the brief, and the judge, having gotten the brief, went to check on, this, they thought, well, I better look up that Martinez versus Delta and Zickerman versus Korean Airlines. And you know what? There was no such thing. The chatbot had invented all of the cases and even invented the findings in the cases, which were quoted. It was totally fiction. And when the attorney asked the chatbot, is all of this true? The chatbot said, you betcha, baby. But I don't know if he said that. So I ask you, I believe, so AI will, artificial intelligence will, because it is being birthed by humans, human intelligence, it will possess a lot of the pluses and the minuses of human beings. And in this case, it's clearly showing that a chatbot has no problem just making things up out of whole cloth. It's capable of doing it. That brief read like a, whoa, if you handed that in law school, you might get an A. Sure look good. Pure fiction. So the first iteration of these artificial intelligence things lie through their teeth. Oh, they don't have teeth. They lie. Yet people will lose their jobs to these guys. Unbelievable. Just saying. If you can find some perspective on that, you're a better person than I. Seriously. And I've been mightily trying to keep my perspective in check. Or broaden it, actually. Not keep it in check. All right, that's it for me. I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm apologizing, but that's what women have been taught to do. It's all our fault. Just ask your religious leaders. It's all our fault. Bye.
Lynn Cullen Live, Monday through Thursday from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. and archived at pghcitypaper.com. The opinions expressed on Lynn Cullen Live are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the viewpoints of Pittsburgh City Paper or its advertisers.